Hi, this is Sav.
This is Katie.
And this is Michael from The Accidentals.
And you're listening to Your Morning Coffee, the podcast with Jay Gilbert and Michael Etchart. Weekly music news for the new music business.
From Variety, inside the multi-billion-dollar battle royale over music streaming royalties.
From Bob Lefsetz, the playlist fallacy.
And from Austin Staubus, the case against the pre-save on Spotify and Apple Music. We got a lot to talk about, Jay. A lot of great stories, a lot of interesting stuff that we will be covering today. So relax, everybody, because this is the Your Morning Coffee podcast, and here we go.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 Standing by. Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Dark woods, tall trees, reaching for me. I think sunlight's gone. Metacognition, keys in ignition, trying to be strong.
Jay, it is so nice to see you on what is a
good to
Saturday
see
for
you.
us, for crying out loud. It's
Yeah.
we are on episode 103. I mean, we are almost about to hit our 2-year mark. In fact, I was going to look it up and see
our 2-year anniversary.
2-year anniversary, yeah, and it's been.
Can you believe it?
It's gone so fast.
It's gone by so fast.
And so
Yeah.
fast. And you know, when you think about it, we started it during the pandemic, you know, so it was.
Yeah.
Our original idea, I think, was to try to do it in person, and then of course we couldn't do it in person when we started, and that has presented a couple of challenges, just kind of figuring out the best way of
Equipment,
the technology
and
of doing it,
how to do
yes,
it,
and how to hear each other and monitor and record on our own side, our own vocal parts, and so it's been so fun, and yet here we are, boom, at 103, and
episode 103,
Goes fast.
and what a beautiful song, Mangrove.
It was beautiful, absolutely gorgeous.
I had my my friend and photography partner Chris Schmidt over yesterday, and we were listening to it, and we both got goosebumps. We had it up pretty loud, and when that orchestra kicks in,
beautiful.
which, by the way, if you don't know, the Accidentals have a brand new album that dropped last Friday with the Kaboom Orchestra. And holy cow, it's really
and the
beautiful.
arrangement is gorgeous. I mean, the playing is superb. The recording is great. The whole thing is it's lovely.
Yeah, and you've heard of the Kaboom Orchestra,
yeah,
right?
I've seen them on. They've. Well, I didn't know their name. I've seen them with different artists. And is it a youth orchestra or like a community orchestra?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a youth orchestra, right?
Yeah, it's a youth orchestra.
And it's conducted by I can't remember the woman's name who was the.
Oh, now you're gonna put me on the spot. Her name is Liza, and I forgot her last name. I'd have to look it up. Sorry,
we'll go with Liza.
Darn it!
I think I saw.
Let's go back and edit that.
That's right. Just slide in her official name.
But they've worked with,
I saw it with Styx,
I think we talked about Styx and Tommy Shaw, yeah, and among others. But they're phenomenal, and this album is just absolutely lush and gorgeous, and it's really sort of a best of in some regards. But what I love about it is they've taken some of these songs that if you're an Accidentals fan, you know a lot of these songs that you hear from their set, but there's some like the song Us or Epitaphs or Lady of the Lake, ones that you may not hear a lot, but that really come to life with this orchestra. So thanks to Sav and Katie and Michael for that cool intro.
Yes,
and check out the Accidentals reimagined with the Kaboom Orchestra.
Talented group, and boy, what a neat collaboration that is indeed.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, when we do this show, Jay, here at episode 103, we have help, right? We really have help. And without our lovely sponsors, we could not put the show on. So we always have to mention that because we are so lucky to have them. It's folks that we've worked with in the past before we even did a podcast. So I do want to mention that the Your Morning Coffee podcast is brought to you by our friends at Bandzoogle, built by musicians for musicians. Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy to build a beautiful website and EPK for your music. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music and merch commission-free crowdfunding and fan subscription features, mailing list tools to grow your fan list and send newsletters. And not only that, it's also social media integrations and live support from their musician-friendly team 7 days a week. Your Morning Coffee podcast listeners can go over to bandzoogle.com to try it free for 30 days and use the promo code MORNINGCOFFEE, all one word, and get 15% off the first year of any subscription. That's bandzoogle.com, promo code MORNINGCOFFEE.
We are also sponsored by our good friends over at Hypebot. Since 2004, Hypebot has chronicled the new music business, all of those trends and technologies that are changing how music is discovered, consumed, marketed, and monetized. It's edited daily by founder Bruce Houghton, with help from Alana Bonilla. Hypebot and sister blog Music Think Tank are published by live music discovery and marketing platform Bands in Town. And speaking of Bands in Town, over 65 million live music fans trust Bands in Town to get personalized concert alerts, recommendations, and messages from their favorite artists. It's the #1 artist services platform, connecting over 550,000 artists with their superfans. Managers, labels, agencies, and artists access their own dashboard to manage and promote their tour dates across all platforms. So thank you so much to Bands in Town, Hypebot, and of course, Bandzoogle.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, don't forget to subscribe to us if you can, wherever you get your podcast. We would certainly appreciate it, Jay and I. And I think we'd also appreciate it if you just mention to one of your friends about the podcast.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. And I stole that idea from Will Page from his Bubble Trouble podcast. I heard him say this, and I thought, that is such a great idea. And I'll just kind of reiterate what Mike just said, and that is just, if you could just tell one person, do us a favor, just tell one person about our little podcast, we would greatly appreciate it.
We certainly would. And boy, we were, as we always do, we've had basically another show that we didn't record where we were just chatting for the last hour.
For like an hour.
Exactly. And now that I finished Stranger Things, now that I finished The Old Man, I apparently have to really watch the Shania Twain documentary.
Oh, yeah. That documentary, well, if you listen to the show, you know that Mike and I are big fans of music documentaries, and there is a new documentary on Netflix about Shania Twain. It's called Not Just a Girl, and it is just wonderfully done, and I won't spoil it because there's so many ups and downs in that, but she is just so driven and so talented, and I was fortunate to know a little bit about how the sausage was made over there because a friend of mine was her guitar player for a couple of tours, and she is like those artists that we talk about. Maybe it's Lady Gaga or Madonna or some of those artists that just they work hard. We always say the harder I work, the luckier I get. Well, she got really lucky because she worked really, really hard, and her collaborations with Mutt Lange, some of the biggest records by females and in country ever. Just a fantastic documentary, Not Just a Girl. It's now on Netflix.
Okay, I got to check that out. And I don't know if you saw it. We did not talk about this in the first hour where we were just talking. If you go over to YouTube, there's some footage of Joni Mitchell performing for the first time in ages, especially and after her health issues, at the Newport Folk Festival with Brandi Carlile. And it is, I mean, it's moving, absolutely beautiful. And I think it was just shot by, it's not a professional, it was something shot by a fan in the audience, but it sounds great. And oh my goodness, if there won't be a dry eye after you watch that. It's
iconic,
unbelievable. Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah. For sure.
By the way, the guy that I get to chat with every week, before and after the record button is hit, is none other than Jay Gilbert. He is my longtime friend and a co-founder of the music marketing and strategy company Label Logic. He's the curator of the Your Morning Coffee newsletter and a former executive with Universal Music, Sony Music, and Warner Music Groups, and Fox Home Entertainment, and a groovy dude all around, a dapper chap.
Thank you so much. And Mike Etchart is longtime host of Sound and Vision Radio, formerly of SST Records, Warner Music, Capital EMI, and Universal Music Groups, one of my favorite people on the planet. And he's also going to tell me a little bit about that SST book we've been talking about.
So
you actually, you read that,
I
right?
read it, yeah.
It's
called Corporate Rock
Tell
Sucks.
us. Now, you've got experience there.
Oh,
so.
yeah, that was my first gig. And it's called Corporate Rock Sucks, The Rise and Fall of SST Records. It was written by Jim Ruland. I'm not exactly, sorry, Jim, I don't know the pronunciation of your last name, I'm not sure of. But it's about, and if you don't know the label, it was founded by Greg Ginn, who was the guitar player in Black Flag. And they were the preeminent, basically punk rock, West Coast punk rock label, and they had an enormous catalog. And this fills in a lot of blanks, because I got in there. It went through different phases of people working there and kind of direction and output. And boy, it really is a great book. So highly recommended. Corporate Rock Sucks: The Rise and Fall of SST Records.
I've got it in my stack. I haven't read it yet. I'm probably going to move it closer to the top after hearing your review. And I'm always interested to hear what someone thinks that was on the inside, because you're either going to have one of two responses. One is, nope, that's not right. That's not accurate. I was there. And we both had that. I've read books, about people who have written about the music industry, and they talk about things where I was in the room and that's not what happened. Right. But then there are things like Steve Knopper has this amazing book called Appetite for Self-Destruction. And it's just one of my all-time favorite music industry books. And he talks about a couple of things when we got to the technology side. And you and I were in the room working at Universal, working for ECAT or E-Labs or whatever division it was at the time. And they talk about people that you and I were at the table with, and it's accurate. Yeah. And when you're on the inside, that. So I wanted to hear from you to see if it was good.
It was really good. And it was, for me, it was a great learning experience because it was my first gig, and it was a super successful independent label. And I did sales and distribution. So I worked with all the indie distributors, both here in the States and internationally. And, you forget about the volatility. And SST Records, as is laid out in the book, a number of different independent distributors, including Green World and Gem and Important Records.
I'd forgotten about them. I was an import buyer at Tower Records, and I remember
all those people. Yeah,
even though a lot of this stuff was domestic, it went through kind of international distributors. Who primarily, those ones you mentioned, did a lot of imports.
Yes, but of course, and all those three mentioned, Green World, Gem, and Important, all went out of business, and all left the indie labels holding the bag for money. And so when I was at SST, the number I heard at the time was about $400,000 that they got screwed on. And
Holy
when
cow.
Important went out, and I think it was more, or it was a different amount for Gem, and Green World was before I got there. But it's tough business being an independent label. And when things like that happen, and as I recall, this was really during the transition between vinyl to CDs. And when I was at SST, we had a bunch. We were waiting for a shipment. We had to pay for it because the shipment had been ordered and had been manufactured of CDs, and they was sitting on the dock. And then one of those indies went out of business. Those distributors, and we didn't have the money. So it's this double-edged sword. We were owed the money. We need to pay the money to the CD manufacturers, which we didn't have all of a sudden. Therefore, we couldn't get the money to keep. It was just really
so disappointing.
Yeah, exactly. But that was the rough and tumble world of indie labels. But I learned a ton, and without that job, I never would have progressed further. And when you look at the bands like Dinosaur Jr. and the Meat Puppets and Soundgarden and all these bands that were on SST that went on to major labels.
Yeah.
And so it was a pretty
good batting record.
They had
there.
They did. Absolutely. So highly recommended. Definitely check it out. Fun stuff. Well, Jay, then it's time to get into the stories because these things we have covered quite a bit over the last, call it 6 months, are still. There's lots of teeth gnashing, shall we say.
Yes, and it's evolving, right? So before we jump into our first story, which is from Variety, and as you and I have talked about many times, Variety is just killing it when it comes to their coverage of the music business. It is just world-class, just amazing stuff. This piece is written by Jem Oswald, and the headline is Inside the Multi-Billion-Dollar Battle Royale Over Music Streaming Royalties. But before we get into it, let's just review some of these things because they've changed and evolved since the last few times that we've talked about it. So I'm going to kick this off just so everybody knows. We're talking about things like the Copyright Royalty Board, and you'll hear us say CRB. That's the Copyright Royalty Board. So the CRB is a 2-year process, like every 5 years. But the 2-year process, it sets the rates for a 5-year period for DSPs, like Spotify and Apple Music, what they pay songwriters, typically via publishers, right? So this CRB3, sometimes it's referred to as Phono Records 3. So CRB3 was set at 15.1%, and that was supposed to run 2018 through 2022. But if you follow this show, you know that, we talk about how in 2019, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Pandora, they appealed that rate. And so it wasn't implemented, right?
Yes.
And that would have raised the mechanical streaming rate, from 10.5 to 15.1% over the years 2018 through 2022. So, because they were appealing it, copyright owners they received a lower rate while this, negotiation was happening.
Exactly. So the retroactive increase for American songwriters is supposed to be paid within 6 months of the verdict being finalized. But the streaming giants have asked for that time period to be extended. So CRB4, or again, Phono Records 4, is in progress, which covers the years 2023 through 2027. A negotiation is expected to begin in September. So the NMPA, which is the National Music Publishers Association, wants DSPs to pay more. And not surprising, Jay, I know this is going to knock you over with a feather. The DSPs want to pay less.
You take that back.
I swear to God, that's what it says here.
You're going to, as we cover this story, you're going to hear about the NMPA. Again, that's the National Music Publishers Association. It's very key here. So at this CRB4 trial, the NSAI and the NMPA, they're both asking for a fourth revenue stream, a per stream payment. Okay? They're seeking of the greater of either, 20% of revenue, 40% of total content cost, which we talked about last week, that TCC, total content cost, or $1.50 per month per subscriber, and a 0.0015 per stream.
I think that's 15 10,000ths of a penny. Is that?
That's right.
Going back to my high school math. Yeah.
I Googled
it. Okay, that's right. So the NMPA claims DSPs are currently proposing the lowest rates ever. They are proposing dropping songwriter percentage from 15.1% to 10% via NMPA proposing moving up to 20% versus NMPA proposing moving up to 20%. So where should the increased payment to songwriters come from? The NMPA claims DSPs can pay more versus rights holders and labels. How do we pay songwriters more? Well, about 30% the DSPs currently keep. About 55% of the revenue paid out to rights holders, which is about 15% to songwriters via CRB3. So,
Yes.
publishing songwriters share split. 80% goes to the songwriter, 20% goes to the publisher. Typically, that's not always, but that's typically. And labels and DSPs operate in a free market. Publishing songwriter rate is set by a third party and is compulsory. So that's important to know as well.
That's CRB, right? So we'll dig into this, but the last point I want to make is that it's not just about the rate that's paid out. It's a bigger picture. You have to look at the overall value of the song to a DSP like Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, etc. DSPs gain stock value that songwriters really don't participate in. And they also gain value in other ways. Amazon has Prime memberships. Spotify is doubling down on podcasts and merch sales via Shopify. And up until last week, they were promoting the car thing. You might have seen that car thing was discontinued last week. And then Apple, they'll get revenue from their product ecosystem, devices, Apple Fitness Plus, etc. So that's kind of a teeing this thing up. So when we talk about the CRB in this piece, because it's really, really important, and it features some quotes from our friend Chris Castle, which is pretty cool. But it's getting a little contentious in some parts.
Yes, a little.
But I'll let you kick it off.
Right. But I do want to say before we start this, we've mentioned this before, and this, when we talk about Spotify, when we talk about Apple, Amazon, Google, tech companies. And as we mentioned at our shared career in the tech space at Universal Music, we would have this parade of people coming in, of tech companies wanting to do business with us, wanting to have these products, these projects that involve music, that they needed music. And they would just continually grind us and want to take the bulk of the profits. They wanted to build businesses on the backs of at the time our music, on the Universal Music Group catalog. And they were so tone deaf. It was just like you could set your watch to it. You knew what was going to happen in these meetings. They would come in, they had this great idea for music, something online, some sort of...
To build their business. And then when negotiations started, they were just horrified that we were asking for the bulk of the profit because, hey, dude, or dudes or chicks, whatever, this is like... this is our lifeblood, and there's a value
there's
to
an enormous
it, I think,
value
is
to
what
it.
you're saying.
Yes.
And of course there is. I do think that that's changed. I love that the music industry is working with companies like Peloton, for example, and they're a top 10 account for most of the majors. And I don't think that could have happened back in our day because of the fact that you just mentioned. They were looking to build a business on the back of the music industry and not really valuing the music for that. And I think that today we're valuing it more than ever, although we have a long way to go.
Yes, but it's just the sort of galling behavior on them to argue about the songwriters or to push back so hard. It's just like, oh, really? But anyway, so yes. And I do want to mention also Jem Oswald, who, he's been around forever, the writer of this piece. Great writer, and I think he worked at labels as well. He was over at Caroline maybe, or one of the labels back in the day. So it's fun when you recognize the names on the masthead of who are writing the articles. So So as we jump into it, as the first line is so great. It's hard to think of a more brain deadening topic than the U.S. Copyright Royalty Board's proceedings over the rates for music streaming. And the fact that we just had to review all of that stuff is really an exclamation point on the brain deadening It's very complex. And as you and I have talked about over the years, back in our days at the labels, this was stuff we didn't really know much about or pay attention to be honest. Of course, it's pre-streaming, but just all of the minutia about copyright rates and things like that. It wasn't something that you dealt with in a day in, day out world.
Right. And let me point out that we're not the smartest guys in the room. We may be the most curious and certainly good looking. I'll give you that. But we've stood on the shoulders of giants because we get to speak to very smart people like Shirley Halperin and like Chris Castle, who's quoted in this piece. And, we can read his website, Music Technology Policy, and we put those stories in your morning coffee regularly. But that's where we learned about it. I didn't know about these things when I was working for Universal. Like you said, it wasn't really part of my day-to-day. It wasn't on my radar. But now I'm really curious about it, and it's mainstream now. You'll read about it in Variety, Rolling Stone, not just in industry trades, like Billboard or your morning coffee to some degree.
Right.
But yeah, it can be dense. It can be difficult. But I think by picking it apart and, that little intro that we did, that's not comprehensive. That's just kind of the high level view of this. If you talk to Chris Castle, trust me, there's a lot more to this.
That's right. But even I have to kind of review it again whenever we talk about it. It's like, okay, wait a minute, where yeah, cause it's dense stuff.
And it's evolving.
Right?
I mean, I sent you some notes because you and I kind of keep this kind of running list of what's going on with this. And it's evolved and changed so much just in the last few months that we had to revise that for this episode today.
Exactly. But as it says in the article, it says caught in the middle are songwriters, and that's what's heartbreaking, to be honest, who are counterintuitively at the bottom of the totem pole in the streaming economy. And you know what? That true words have never been spoken. And as the article says, the two sides in this deeply dysfunctional symbiotic relationship, in the words of one executive, have devolved into squabbling partisan camps that are nevertheless completely dependent upon each other. Every deal point with the tech sector is contentious, one top music executive says, but this one's gotten so bitter. I mean, can't we get along? And that's really so true, and it's tragic.
Yeah, you've got two different worlds colliding here with two different outcomes that they want. On the music side, you've got your publishing companies, and those are dominated by the three majors, Sony, Universal, and Warner. And on the streaming side, you've got Amazon Music, YouTube, which is owned by Google, Alphabet, Pandora, owned by SiriusXM / Liberty Media, and then, of course, the global market leader, Spotify. Now, you'll notice I didn't mention Apple Music. They're, of course, the world's second largest service, DSP, and they stayed out of the last round of this fight, letting the other companies kind of take the bullets, as one top executive puts it. But sources confirm to Variety, anyway, that it's, they're on board for the next round. CRB4.
Yes, exactly. And I wonder what their stance will be on that. We will find out. We will absolutely find out. Yeah. So, that sort of sets the table really and kind of what we're talking about. It's and then of course a lot of this stuff what you talk about is, this is a model, as they say, it was jerry-rigged from the CD and vinyl era, where streaming royalties are divided two ways. As we talked about, 75 to 80% typically split between the performing artist and usually a label, while about 20 to 25% go to publishing. And this uneven division of the revenue was originally calculated to account for the expenses that labels incurred in the manufacture and distribution of course, vinyl, CD, and tapes. That basically the physical product. And they say that lopsided split may or may not still make sense in the streaming age, depending on whom you ask. And this, of course, is really, really interesting concept as well, which is, what is the value now of a record label? And what do record labels do? Are they doing enough for that considerable split? And
right. And some would argue that they're still incurring costs of, whether it's servers or people to, make sure that all of this music and metadata is, uploaded correctly, and, just the infrastructure surrounding that, and that there's still marketing, there's still PR, there's still sync, there's still touring support, there's all sorts of things where labels add value. But I think the argument here is that, wait a second, we've had these costs because we had CDs, vinyl, cassettes, etc. We don't have those anymore. So certainly that ecosystem needs to be re-looked at.
Well, and I think you and I've talked about this a little bit, and I think anybody observing the way marketing of music has happened now is, I think labels in general have more releases and less intensive marketing. And I'm seeing this in the book industry as well, in publishing, which is they tend to release lots of things and they wait for something to catch, and then they spend the money.
Pour gasoline on that fire.
That's exactly right. And so I think they're not doing as much marketing as they were doing in our era up front. Typically in those days, for the most part, most records would get a shot. They would do a fair amount of marketing and work to get that thing out. I'm seeing less of that now. I think that's just, I don't know if you agree with me on that. You're working with artists much more closely than I am. But
well, I think that there's a couple of schools of thought there. One is, we've talked about, there always will be strong labels that are doing really, really great work. Atlantic, Interscope, New West, None Such. The list goes on and on and on. And I'm not bashing labels, but there are some where folks are getting lazy and they're looking for that TikTok breakout. So they're standing on the shoulders of giants. They can release something that already has demand in the marketplace. And as we grew up in the industry, we had artist development, meaning that there was no demand in the marketplace, and you would do those things that we would do, get them out on the road as a support act to try to build it up, hopefully work some of their songs at radio, have a good publicist and a good narrative that they could talk about. There were all sorts of things. I just think that it's such a different world now. I'm not one of those people that has abandoned the album, although I know that today it's a track-based economy. The other thing that you touched on is, look, the industry has always had a low success rate.
Yes.
Right now, I believe the last figure I read was like a 93% failure rate if you're just looking at ROI, the return on investment. And that's why it comes back to what you said. The record industry has always done that, where they would sign, I'll make up a round number, 10 artists, and they work and they put it out there and see what kind of gets radio airplay, what kind of takes off, and then they double down on those ones and make them the priorities. And that's those two that are successful pay for the 8 that weren't.
Right, exactly. But you have the labels claiming that they're still doing a lot for their cut, which is not insignificant. Then on the other side of the coin, you have executives at streaming services argue that it is very much in the majors' interest to maintain that system because labels can make deductions on those expenses, and note that the system is riddled with conflicts because the world's 3 major music groups own the 3 largest labels and the 3 largest publishers. Also, publishers take a significantly lower percentage of streaming royalties, about 25% according to the NMPA, than labels do for most artists. And of course, what really complicates the situation further is that labels' streaming royalties are determined by free market negotiations between the music companies and streamers, but while publishing is determined by the government via the Copyright Royalty Board panel. So it's an unbalanced system that has no real parallel anywhere else in the world. As one music exec calls it, absurd, archaic, and unnecessary. Wow. But it's not likely to change in the foreseeable future. So you've got these weird things, and they quote Chris Castle here. It says, consequently, we've had this lopsided arrangement between publishing and sound recordings for a long time because sound recordings can set their own prices. He's as what Chris says, who dates the split to a 1909 law governing player piano rolls. So that kind of, it's like, yes, we're talking about this stuff that dates back to the old player pianos and those rolls you would buy that had music on them. So your player piano, that was sort of the stereo of the day, So it's remarkable that we're having these discussions, and it really goes back to these goofy kind of early 1900s business practices.
Oh, right. And even the price of subscription, which we're going to cover here in a second, look, the industry is almost healthier than it's ever been. It's more, as we've pointed out before, it's $15 billion. It's more revenue than ever, but if you adjust for inflation, it's not quite at that peak 1999 yet. But at the time of Spotify's U.S. launch, that was in 2011, the U.S. recorded music industry had seen its value cut in half. If you're looking at it, versus the previous decade, right? Just cut in half. And that was because of illegal downloading, CD sales were dropping. And so then streaming comes along. And although those royalties were a pittance compared to the bounty, from physical CDs, the pricing model changed from around $18 for an album to $10 a month for many millions of songs. It was a vast improvement over nothing, and it helped that free fall, kind of stop immediately. So fast forward to this last year, like I said, recorded music revenues, $15 billion. And then, of course, Goldman Sachs, their annual Music in the Air report last month forecasts that boom to continue. And I would just encourage our listeners to check out the Media forecast from Mark Mulligan. I think those are maybe a bit more accurate, as we talked about a little bit with Will Page. So, despite the industry's revival, the U.S. subscription price, which was set at $9.99 a month at the dawn of the streaming age more than 20 years ago to mirror the cost of a Blockbuster video rental subscription. Remember, Will Page told us about that.
Absolutely.
So it's complicated. The CRB, they acknowledge that songwriters deserve a greater share, in that last ruling, that CRB 3. So it's going to 15.1%. We've talked about that a lot, up from 11.4% the previous period. And again, that was challenged by the DSPs. And now we're rolling into the next 5 years. Right?
Yes.
We're going to have, it starts in September, which is, less than 2 months away. And here we go again.
Yeah. And it's going to be ugly. And, I think, at least for the last round, I was kind of surprised. It seemed like everybody was really far apart. And then it kind of at the 11th hour, it seems like it kind of came together. And then we got a ruling. I can't, my crystal ball is very foggy and hazy on this next one. I don't see how, it just seems like everyone is so far apart. I don't see how it's gonna be resolved.
Yeah, it's a lot more contentious, I think, now than it's been in the past. And we've followed David Israelite. He's the president of the NMPA. And in this piece, they talk about some quote unquote aggressive tactics and verbiage, that were on full display at their annual meeting in June. He portrayed the CRB battle as unambiguous as you can possibly imagine, characterizing it as, songwriters and publishers fighting for fair rates for songs that make these digital services possible. And I don't think anybody would really argue that. We've heard this a lot, that the people who are writing the songs are making the least amount of money in this ecosystem, and we wouldn't have this business, if it wasn't for them. It's like this, now we've got this David versus Goliath thing, and it's multi-billion-dollar corporations. And, the NMPA has described the DSP's appeal as suing songwriters. Yikes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's, and there's a piece in there where they mention that, again, we're talking, and we talked about this with Will Page, which is, it's still $10 a month, and nobody wants to step forward and
be the first.
Netflix has no problem raising their rates. Nobody over there, blinks and does. They just do it, and that to me is one of the most frustrating things in all of this is that.
Yeah, but the difference is Netflix, they have things that Hulu doesn't have, and vice versa. Apple and Amazon and Deezer and Spotify, they basically have the same thing.
Correct.
So
That's
if
true.
somebody does step out and say, you know what, I'm going for $12.99, you may have your playlist built up in there and you're like, it's worth it. It certainly is. Or you may go, you know what, I'm just going to jump over this one that's cheaper and rebuild my playlist. So you're comparing to, apples to oranges a little bit there, but you're absolutely right. In that video streaming world, that people have just rode along with it when they've had these price increases.
Right, and everything has gone up so dramatically. I just think that I think the market can easily. I don't think there'll be a giant especially if you're Spotify and you say, listen, we're going to raise our rates $2 a month. It's going to go up to $11.99 or whatever, or whatever the number is. But if you say, but at the same time you do that, and then agree to stop arguing about this. I mean, you could flip it from a marketing standpoint and be the good guys, right? If you want to take that advantage. But as the article ends, is the outcome will depend on how reasonable all parties can be. One top music executive says,
Yes.
We all have an aligned interest in bringing as much music as possible to as many people as possible. So how do we grow the music market in the face of competition from other forms of entertainment that cost less? Social media, gaming, online TV. How do we put more focus on the value of music? The executive concludes that's what we need to be talking about. And then I would add to that, and let's not make the songwriters the stepchildren in this entire process. It's just so frustrating because there would be no business without songwriters.
Amen.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So great piece by Jem over there at Variety, and great coverage as always by Variety, and great article. And it's boy, oh boy, oh boy. I wish I were more optimistic than I am sitting here right today.
Well, I'm optimistic only because this was kept in the shadows for years and years. And just in the last 2 to 3 years, we started reading about it and digging into it. And now it's on everybody's minds and everybody's talking about it. And I do think these processes, these things have been around for so long. It's time. And I think people are realizing that it's just a matter of how do we slice up that pie equitably. And I think most people would agree that songwriters deserve a pay raise.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's jump over to our next article, Jay, with Bob Lefsetz, and we
don't talk too much about Bob Lefsetz, but everybody in the industry reads his newsletter. He's never short of an opinion. I don't always agree with him, but I think he's always very thoughtful and articulate, and some of his podcasts,
they're great.
His interview with Donald Passman was amazing. His interview with Irving Azoff, I thought, was just awesome. But I did want to touch on, I don't think we've ever done this before, but I want to pull up his newsletter from last week because it ties in beautifully to what we just covered, about the CRB and the CMA and all of that. But it talks about the value of playlists and how people stress, I always say a playlist is not a marketing plan, but we hear it a lot. And I really enjoyed this because what Bob did is one of the things he did was he kind of highlighted this story in Music Ally. Mm-hmm. And the headline was, what's driving streams on Spotify, YouTube Music, Apple Music, and Amazon Music? And they put in a table in here and showed where the plays were coming from. And it was surprising to a lot of people that it wasn't really those algorithmic or Spotify curated playlists, that these streams came from other areas. So what he's saying here, if you study that table, you'll learn the power of playlists is way overstating. Yes, all the bitching is how you can't get on playlists. The bottom line, this is according to Bob, the bottom line on Spotify, the biggest streaming service and with the most active customers, meaning they stream the most music, 50 to 60% of listening is done via user-curated playlists. That's huge, right? What that means, well, you know what it means. You build your own playlist, you listen to it as opposed to the ones, served up by Spotify. So I just thought that was really interesting, and also that 10 to 20% of listening on Spotify is not from a playlist. And I would say a majority of mine is I'm going in there, I read about something, or somebody told me about something, or you told me about something, and then I go on there and I search for it and I listen to it, whether it's on Apple Music or, whatever the DSP is.
Yeah. And by the way, as we mentioned, this is basically UK streams, and this was done as part of that whole thing that was happening in the UK. But the number again that jumped out at me is, if you look at Spotify, user curated playlists, 50 to 60%. I mean, that's dramatic. And when you look at the as they say, the algotorial, only 10 to 20% on Spotify.
Well, let me explain for those that don't know what algotorial is. It's an amalgamation of, editorial and algorithmic, but it's really not that. What it is what they call personalized playlists. And that's where, if you see, let's say one of your artists is in a playlist, it'll say personalized by it, like in Spotify for Artists, meaning that the version that I'm looking at, that may be that track in the number one position.
Right.
That same playlist that you look at based on your listening habits may not be on there at all, or it may be the last one in that playlist. So that's personalized. And then the last thing I'll just note really quickly, if you want to share a playlist, let's say that you get added to a personalized playlist, go to Spotify for Artists, and then you can share it from within Spotify for Artists, and it will keep you at that spot. Let's say you're in the number one spot. So,
interesting.
Little handy tip.
Interesting. So, but because this is really your area of expertise, Jay, where do you sit with Bob's analysis that it's highly, highly, highly overrated, and in fact, so many people are just using their own user curated playlists?
I think he's right and wrong.
Okay.
And I'll explain. It's like Will Page saying, give me an economist with one hand, because they're always on this hand.
On the one hand, on the other hand.
So I think he's spot on with a lot of what he's saying here. But the part that is not in this, that's missing, is getting on a big playlist, a popular playlist. Some of those are only for a week or two. They can change the trajectory. It may not be the percentage of streams, it's the velocity and the timing of that. We had Travis Tritt get onto a couple of really important playlists that really helped that record. Vintage Trouble, My Whole World Stopped, was on Mellow Morning in the number one slot. Now, overall, that was a small percentage of the streams, like this table says, but I can't stress enough, it was the velocity. It happened very quickly. It helped us get on other DSPs. It helped them get noticed. It helped radio when they see things spike. So it's not just the percentage. It's also, the velocity and the total number and the timing.
Explain velocity again, because that's an interesting word to use when you're talking about playlists.
Yeah, it's just, think of it as like you turning on a faucet and how much water is coming out. If it's just a trickle, that's a low velocity. You're not getting a ton of streams there. But sometimes you can get that thing on full blast. It may be only on full blast for a week, and it may only account for a small percentage overall of your streams. But because it happened quickly, that triggers things sometimes. When people see things overperform or spike, that can help you with your marketing. That can help you with your radio airplay sometimes. It can help you with maybe if you're booking a festival and they see something that's popping. It's the devil is in the details.
Right. Now, he goes on in this article to say the streaming music platforms are terrible about music discovery. So that's an unambiguous opinion there.
Well, depends who you are. If you're, a young person who's listening primarily to certain playlists and you're discovering things, I get what he's saying, but for me, that's not true. For me, when I use the different DSPs differently, and I have them all because of my job, and I realize that that's weird. But let's take Spotify, for example. Release Radar, Discover Weekly they're amazing. I mean, I've been served up things, and it's like Will Page said when we spoke to him, it's not discovery necessarily, it's rediscovery. Like, here's that thing we know you're going to like. You probably have this album, but you haven't broken it out in a long time, and here's one of these tracks we want you to rediscover. We think you're really going to like. And for me, I can only speak for me. They work really, really well. And the other thing is some of these radio, like on Apple Music, I happen to like these British bands like Oasis and Blur and some of those. Yeah. And I was listening to one of these Apple stations kind of based on that music. Oh my gosh, I listened to it all day and it was amazing. And I kept jotting down things like artists I hadn't discovered yet. So I guess it just depends on how you listen. I think everybody's different. He's not wrong. It can be challenging on these things to discover new music, but for me, it's not.
He has interesting point in here as well. He says, so if a song gets traction on TikTok, fans will go to their streaming service of choice to listen to it. The listening is done on the DSP, but the discovery is done on TikTok.
Yes. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we talk about that it's such a big deal. It reminds me of when streaming first kind of started, like 2011, around then, streaming was kind of modeling some of their playlists after what was going on at radio. Mm-hmm. Well, that's flipped. The tail's wagging the dog there. So it's really more about, radio looking at what's happening on streaming. And you bring up TikTok. Man, we've talked about that a lot. TikTok is really driving music discovery. It's driving developing artists. It's doing a lot for the ecosystem. But some of these artists only have 15 seconds of a song when they get discovered. Some of them have never played a live show. It's more complicated than just music discovery.
Yes, it is. But I would say that Bob is always a great read, and he's much like some of the people we really enjoy. He is very sassy. He's very opinionated.
Yes, he is.
But he's a great writer, very well read, and very. You can tell that he puts a lot of work into it. And so, if you're not on his list, and that was one of the first email lists I ever subscribed to. I'm trying to remember how long ago it's been, but it's forever. Yeah.
There was like the Velvet Rope. There was Digital Music News and Left Sets and. I still belong. Well, it's not the Velvet Rope, but certainly the Pho list is amazing, and I read that all the time. But look, Bob is super smart, super experienced. If you want to hear a really great interview with a couple of people with law degrees talking about the music business, check out the Donald Passman interview with Bob Lefsetz. It's phenomenal because that version 10 of that Passman book is not like the others. Each one is a new edition is updated when he does them, but it's so drastic with this 10th edition that I highly recommend that people check it out. But they basically almost go chapter by chapter. Mm-hmm. And
it's a great interview. It's a great interview.
It's a really great
Absolutely. Interview. Well, let's jump over to our last story, Jay, from Austin Staubach. How do you pronounce his last name?
I think it's Staubach.
Staubach? Yeah, okay. The case against the pre-save on Spotify and Apple Music. And I'm going to guess that you might have a slightly differing opinion on this. I'm going to take a wild guess.
I do have a little bit different opinion, but let's see where we find some common ground.
Okay. So right? It starts with saying true. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that he talks about how, if you think that you're going to get noticed by the DSPs as far as their, their artist relations or curators or editors and get on some of their, DSP curated playlists, that, that's probably not going to happen. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think it depends on what you're doing with your pre-save. And one thing he didn't touch on, which I tell clients all the time, is I'll see, let's say someone saying, here, enter to win this guitar. All you have to do is, pre-save, my new album. That's a bad idea. And the reason for that is you don't want to send a bunch of people to your, let's say you're dropping your new music into their library on street date, and then they're not going to listen to it. They might be just entering to win that thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's never a good idea. I had someone at Spotify tell me once that if someone's going to pre-save your album, track, whatever it is, make sure they're a real fan that's actually going to listen to it. Otherwise, it's going to show up as someone who's got something that they're not really listening to.
Right. By the way, to me, in this article, the most interesting thing was he talked about who invented the pre-save, which I don't know if you knew that story. Did you know the story? Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say it briefly. But
Go for it.
Yeah, the pre-save was invented by David Emery, who was then the VP of Digital Marketing at AWOL. At the time, David was looking for a way through Spotify's public API to create a digital version of an iTunes pre-order for a Laura Marling release he was tasked with. During the iTunes generation, you may remember, before streaming was ubiquitous, pre-orders were of great importance to the majors as it gave them the ability to project future sales and success at radio. As he said, David explained, I went for a walk and I just had all these things whirling around in my head. What is it we can do here? And it literally just came to me. We can use this API, make a thing that's like pre-ordering, but for Spotify. That would work really well and would be really quite straightforward. The functionality had been there for years in the API. You and I talked a little bit about the API before we hit record. And it makes it sound like that's an open source thing that anybody can go look at. And that's not exactly the case, is it?
I'm not sure. I know there is a public API that people can use for some of these DSPs, and I should ask our friends over at Microgroove because they understand this stuff a lot better than I do. But the bottom line is there isn't a way for to pre-save with a DSP yet. Spotify said that they're working on something for that, which I think will be really interesting. And it's something that this public API, and for those that don't know, the simple way is an API is just a piece of software that lets one platform communicate with another, right? So David explained that, they came up with this API, and so with Spotify, and they could do the pre-save, and I think Apple calls it the pre-add, and it's basically a pre-order. They're all the same things. You just, commit to something ahead of time. Now, back when there were downloads, we called it instant grat. The instant grat track, meaning instant gratification, right? Where if you buy this album today, we will instantly gratify you by giving you this one song or these two songs early. And that was what we were trying to do with streaming. Find a way to get people to pre-order something, right? So they had it, and then hopefully on street date, they would play it more. I think that pre-saves are valid. I think they're important. I think that with the number of tracks that are released every day and just the sheer volume, and sometimes even myself with artists that I really love, sometimes I'll miss that if I'm not careful. Mm-hmm. And I wish there was an easy way on all these platforms to just say, you know what, I love the Accidentals or Josh Groban or whoever. I'm going to click a button, and whenever they put out music, I want you to automatically drop it into this playlist.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
To me, that would be really valuable.
Austin in this article says, talking about this kind of the whole pre-save thing, I've always questioned the merits of the pre-save. In David's defense, the pre-save was an early innovation in 2016. It was a resounding success at the time because no one else had done it. That's why it worked. To succeed in life and in music, you must do the opposite of what everyone else is doing. David Emery did just that and made his mark on business as a result. But I think his take is it's not, for a variety of reasons, it's not a great idea. But I don't know. You work with artists so much. He talks about editors are not evaluating your record based on how many pre-saves it has. Asking your right.
Uh-huh. That's true. But that doesn't mean that it's not valuable.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
And why I say that is because by, out of sight, out of mind, even though the editors, curators may not be judging you on that, certainly if you get more spins by having that there, that is a positive thing. He talks about the Spotify algorithm a little bit, and we've done a little bit of research on the Spotify algorithm, and he talks about some basic things like, spins are good, skips are bad, adds to personal libraries and playlists, that's good. You could also add to that, that probably optimizing your artist page, I'm just talking about Spotify right now, and maybe adding a Canvas video, those kinds of things are good. But here's some things that Spotify says is in their algorithm. And again, this isn't Mike's opinion. This isn't Jay's opinion. This is what they've said, publicly at conferences or on their website. And I just want to read off a few of these. So besides what I just mentioned, when they're looking for what they're going to drop into those, personalized kind of playlists, especially things like Release Radar, Discover Weekly, here are a few things that they look at. And again, this is from them. Songs you have on repeat, listening habits of people with similar tastes, artist input, right? That's, Spotify for artists, making sure your artist profile is in good shape. The music elements of the track, similarity to other artists you listen to, genres you listen to, song length. I thought that was important. And then the languages you listen to. So I'm not a big believer in discounting pre-saves. I understand the premise of this piece is that, well, why do a pre-save if the editor curators aren't going to use that as your scorecard? Right. They may not use that, but they certainly will, or at least the algorithm will see, if you're getting a lot of plays, which would come hopefully from that pre-save thing. And the last thing I'll say just really quickly is that our good friend Mike Warner had captured this video of this test on Florence and the Machine's Dance Fever release, and that featured a tracklist preview and a countdown clock. And, I guess what I'm saying is they're toying with the idea of testing pre-saves directly in the app. And I think that's long overdue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great piece to have the conversation about, and I know you have this conversation with artists all the time. And if you didn't mention it, that's you have cataloged those comments that Spotify has made over the years. And that's super important. The value you bring to artists you work with is that you pay attention to that stuff. And that is super important and very, we reap the benefit of your fastidious study habits, Jay.
Please. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, we must wrap up episode 103. My goodness, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for everyone for listening in. And of course, we must thank our sponsors, including Bandzoogle, Hypebot, and Bands in Town. And don't forget to subscribe to us if you'd be so kind, and maybe tell a friend. Just one friend.
Thank you so much.
About what we do. Yeah, because we enjoy it and we appreciate everyone listening in. So on behalf of my good friend, the dapper Jay Gilbert, I say thank you and thanks for joining us this week. And we will see you next time on the Your Morning Coffee Podcast.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.